Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Reward in China webinar. My name is Kayla Bittner, and I'm a member of Hey Group's team. I just want to get started with a few housekeeping items before we get moving here, and I just want to note that you can maximize your screen in the upper right corner to make the slides easier to read. The webinar is in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to send your questions through the chat feature at the bottom left of your screen. At the end of the webinar, we will be reviewing your questions. Today's call is scheduled for 60 minutes. We'll spend about half this time going through the presentation and leaving the rest of the time for questions. Lastly, I just want to point out that all attendees today will receive a copy of today's presentation. So at this point in time, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Wendy Nicholls, who will get us kicked off.
Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about China. Firstly, what I would like to do is introduce my colleague, Catherine Lai. Catherine, would you like to say hello? Catherine? Oh, we seem to have lost audio with Catherine, so just hold on 1 minute.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
Catherine.
Yeah, sorry. I should say good noon, everyone. This is Catherine Lai from Hey Group China. As a consultant and Northeast Asia FMCG sector leader for 5 years here. So I have been specializing in reward and market survey. So I'm happy here be presenting the market trend together with my colleague Wendy.
Thanks, Catherine. So as for myself, I'm the Regional Director for North Asia and Pacific, and my role therefore includes China. I've chosen to base myself here in China, and I have the pleasure of calling Shanghai my home for over 2 years now. What we're going to be doing over the next 40 minutes or so will be to give you a high-level overview and some insight into the Chinese market, in particular looking at remuneration trends and practices. Pay is a major issue for companies in China, but when you unpack it, it's often the effect and not the cause. It's the effect of many other issues, including retention, career development, and leadership, all of which are interlinked. And I want to share with you why this is so. So if we go on to the agenda, the 40-minute presentation will follow as such. We'll give an overview of the economy, and then we'll show how this growing economy has actually impacted reward and HR. Catherine will then take you through some practical tips for what you need to take into account when you're using market data. And then finally, I'll provide you with some of the ongoing challenges that we see looking ahead. And after that, we're more than happy to answer some of the questions. So HR and reward in China is an enormous topic, and I can honestly talk about it for days. So given I have 40 minutes, this is going to be a high-level sweep of the issues, and it assumes you have some but not extensive working knowledge of China. And for those who do have more extensive working knowledge, hopefully I will confirm some of your findings in here as well. Of course, Hey Group would be more than happy to assist in helping further should you want to go into any more detail on any of these topics, and you're more than happy to contact us accordingly as well. So if we go on to the economic overview now. To help put China into context, what I've done is put a slide together here to compare and contrast with the US, given that that's the audience for the webinar today. Although the US and China are very similar in terms of land mass, there is a considerable difference in almost every other area. China's population is 4 times that of the US. People of China use one language, but multiple dialects in the local provinces, which can sound significantly different from each other. Everybody's aware that China is an economic powerhouse, number 2 behind the USA. But the GDP growth in China is certainly outpacing most countries, sitting at around 8% per year at the moment, and it's been running at these very high rates for many, many years. However, where the US ranks very high in terms of GDP per capita or per person, China is only sitting at 93rd. And this brings many other challenges to overcome, some of which you will actually see getting presented today. If we go on to the next slide now and look at the economic trends. When we look a little closer at the economy of China, we can see the trends, shifts, and issues that they're facing. Manufacturing has long been a driver of the Chinese economy. China makes the products that the rest of the world buys. I know when I visit Australia and I want to bring a gift back to China, it's very hard to avoid trying to re-import something that was actually originally made in China. This industry will continue to grow in China, but it's not expected to grow at the same pace that we've seen in the past. This is because the longer-term goal for China is to become its own consumer. It's to start manufacturing products for its own people to buy, rather than just relying on exporting. This is being driven by the Chinese government, and it's going to result in a rise in the middle classes within China. We're also seeing a shift to the service industry growth and large investments in research and development recently. Foreign-owned companies are still coming into China, but it's the rise of the private local Chinese giants that is really changing the face of competition in China and making commercial competition much more fierce. Certain areas of China face quite some challenges. Rural China continues to see large proportions of its working-age population migrating to the cities, leaving only the children and the elderly behind. This means that whilst the developed and developing cities are attracting major investments, some of the rural areas have lagged behind quite significantly. In the past, the pressure was always to move to Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, these first-tier cities. But now there are many fast-growing, smaller cities that are closer to those rural areas, and they're becoming very attractive and are creating significant economic hubs in other locations. There's also the issue of a fast-aging population, particularly with the impact of the one-child policy contributing to a potential workforce gap in China in the near future. And the Chinese leadership are having to create quite some policies at the moment to try and deal with these things. So what's the impact of this fast-growing economy on pay? Well, many of the multinationals that we work with are actually looking to expand their operations in China, and they're always really surprised by the pay at which employees now demand, particularly at the senior management level. If we can have a look at the next slide. In fact, our data in our PayNet databases shows that pay levels have shifted substantially in China. If we have a look, for example, at the 10 years between 2001 and 2011, senior management salaries in China rose by 3.5 times. If we look in comparison for the US, senior management pay typically rose by about 1.4 times for the same period looking at the same job in this case. Such a pronounced convergence of the salary levels will now begin to really have impact on how companies approach their international operations. And it's only going to get closer because the China salary movement over 2012 was 9.4% and in the US was 1.5%. So given that as a sort of an overview of the economics, now what I'd like to move on to is what kind of an impact that has on reward. So if we go onto the next slide, the first thing I'm going to talk about is what I refer to as the price of promotion. This very rapid rise in the senior management pay that I referred to in the first section has actually led to a very steep pay curve within China. So if we have a look at the next slide, I'll try and explain what I mean by this. What we can see here is along the x-axis are the Hay Group reference levels. Basically, this is referring to the size of a job. It's the way that we measure a job according to the job's accountability, the problem solving, and the knowledge required to do the job. Those in levels 7 to 11 tend to be the clerical operations roles, 12 to 16 are the supervisory and junior professional junior management, and 17 to 20 being the middle management and senior professionals. The y-axis on my chart is showing the base salary in local RMB currency for the market median. And what we mean by having this very steep pay curve is resulted because multinational companies have wanted managers that have experience in a multinational, they are bilingual, and they have management experience. the group of people with all of these things within China is actually very small. So from this very tight labor market, these multinationals will find a person who can best fit that and then pay lots to recruit them in. And this is really putting a pressure on those management levels and creating that very steep pay curve. What it means is that the lower end are paid very low compared to, for example, in the US. But as you saw on my earlier slides, at the senior level, they're almost becoming on par with US salaries. When you have an extremely steep pay curve like this, what it can mean is that pay progression or when people get a promotion, it actually becomes very expensive. If you have a look at the slide and you can see that if somebody was to have a promotion from a grade 18 to a grade 20, we refer to that as a 2-grade or 2-step promotion, they would in effect get an 83% pay rise. You can imagine that such a significant increase means that people are driven and seek these promotions. But what you also find that in many cases, those people getting promoted into those roles actually have very little experience and are probably, and more often than not ready for that particular role as well. But if you don't promote them into that role, one of your competitors is going to do that. What this has meant is that there are very high expectations from people to move up quickly and to get large pay increases regularly. We see many multinational companies trying to deal with this by putting mid-steps into their broader pay bands. And in effect, what they're trying to do is to manage this progression and give that feeling of a regular promotion like the peers in the market might be getting. So in effect, they're creating an internal environment in the company similar to the external environment that people are getting by job hopping. What I want to do is to go on to the next slide and show this comparison to the US. So as I said, at a middle management role, if you do a 2-step promotion, you will get an 83% pay increase. If you were to do the same promotion on our grading system within the US, you would typically get about a 29% pay increase. So what you can see is that China has a very fast pay progression, and actually it is the fastest across all of Asia as well, and creating that very high temptation to move for higher pay. Most of the established or developed markets look more like what we see over here on the US. So what's really exacerbating this problem? If we have a look at the next slide, the China manager is typically only staying for about 3 years. So this slide will show turnover, and you will see that most people are leaving their roles within 3 to 5 years. And can you guess what the worst job family is going to be? The worst job family for this turnover is human resources, the same team that are often building those retention packages. But it is because in multinational companies, people who have human resource experience within the China market are also in high demand. To handle this turnover, we see many multinationals are trying to focus on career development, training, and opportunities like that. Because if we move on to the next slide, which shows the turnover by age, we can see that most turnover is happening between 25 and 30-year-olds. These are people who have a couple of years' experience now in a multinational. They're becoming very attractive to those outside of the market and can job hop very, very easily. So if we can move on to the next slide. What happens is this very steep curve and this pay progression provides huge incentives for employees to seek out those promotions earlier. And this drive, as well as the gap in the talent pool for leadership, means that China has ended up with some of the youngest leaders, even within Asia. The gap between China and other Asian countries is about 3 to 5 years when you look at the same role in terms of the age of the leader. But when you compare it against the mature economy, it's more like 5 to 8 years and sometimes as much as 10. So the result of this is that we have a young, and very stretched workforce, because remember I said that quite often they're being moved into roles that they're not actually ready for. So a young and very stretched workforce that's forming the management. And this becomes a self-perpetuating cycle within China, because the staff reporting to those managers, their confidence in the ability of senior management is the most important predictor of turnover. Staff want to feel proud to be part of a successful, well-led company where they feel business is in good health for the future and it's worth investing their time. So for this reason, you always need to have the right leaders in place and invest in that leadership capability to try and reduce the turnover. But if, as you've seen on the previous slides, it's the leaders who are leaving, obviously that impacts the turnover at the lower levels as well. So we feel that the largest challenge facing many companies in China is to do with the local management talent. It's in fact the retention of not only leaders but good leaders. That's the biggest challenge facing HR within China. So that's where I said that pay is quite often the effect rather than the cause. And so what many companies need to do is to develop their people management skills in China and the retention of these managers, because this is what's actually going to impact the staff the most and hopefully help get some control on the pay. So with that overview and that context, what I'm going to do now is pass over to Catherine. Catherine's going to take you through the implications that this implies when you're actually looking at market data within China.
Okay. Thanks for Wendy introducing the overall China market. As we can see, China as a kind of a typical emerging market is experiencing a faster development area. China is big geographic-wise, but quite different and imbalanced in terms of the economic development. So as a result, the salary level are also quite different across China. So let's come to the next slide. Yeah, there is a common acceptance of a tiered system. The first-tier tiers are Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. The rest normally we call the non-first-tier cities. So, the first-tier cities, normally they got a focus of several features here. Come to the next slide, we can see the features. Yeah, the China first-tier cities, they got a focus like the commercial activities, higher talent levels, prevalence of multinational companies, expatriate, as well as the high cost of living. So in this case, the HRs in the first-tier cities, they are also facing some challenges like the sourcing local talent, transfer of the management knowledge, relocation, and the managing pay structure across different locations, as well as the training and the development programs. So if you have the operations in China, now we would like you to pour for your focus on challenges in 2013 in this year. So let's come to the poll page. Yeah, now you can pull for your challenges and focus in China. Okay, so since the beginning till right away, I I can see the most, most biggest challenging is still the globally consistent pay. So, Wendy and myself in China are often being asking by these questions how we can managing the consistent pay structure in China and the rest of the world. So this is indeed a big challenge because of different culture. So the following challenges, the second biggest challenging is sourcing the local leaders, and the following is the training development, followed by the transfer of the management knowledge. So several people choose the relocation allowance. So actually, those 5 are quite hot topic in China locally. So Hey Group, we do have several service or information sharing on this topic in the coming year and the coming service season. So that's quite interesting findings. We can see the top challenges still the globally consistent pay issues here. Okay, so let's go back to the city tier theory in China. So because of the high human cost in the first-tier cities, we can see the new trends in the first-tier cities is not traditional manufacturing anymore. So let's come to the next page. The new trend is that the booming industries in the first-tier cities are 3 of them. One is the financial sector. Second one is knowledge, means the educational service. And also we got some other professional service industries booming in the first-tier cities. So in the meantime, many companies here more are like the traditional manufacturing companies, and as well as some like the consumer goods companies. They are relocating the manufacturing plants in the cheaper cities, like we call the non-first-tier cities. So here, let's see what is happening in the non-first-tier cities. Come to the next page. While the non-first-tier cities we call is quite a generic ideas. So among the hundreds of the non-first-tier cities, the East Coast regions normally pay better than inland cities. Considering the industrial chain in the first-tier cities, and the government incentivize more and more companies expanding in those non-first-tier cities. So the trend nowadays is that we can see more and more manufacturing and like the high-tech companies is moving to the non-first-tier cities, including the Motorola, Nokia, and the Coca-Cola. Although the non-first-tier cities, they have the lowest wage, but they are actually experiencing the most rapid growth as well. So if you want to see the pay difference in different cities in China, so how Hey Group PayNet can help you on that? So let's come to see what we can get from PayNet. Okay, so here we can see what is PayNet looks like. Here, let's see what we can do on the PayNet to select the different cities and to see different results. For instance, if we choose the first-tier cities, we just press Control, choose Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. So also here you can define the industry you're fitting, and as well as the number of employees and the ownership unit, the revenue size, as well as the ownership. Later we'll introduce a little bit on the ownership. Then go to the next, and later then we can come to the result. Choose different job families and the pay aggregates and then generate a result. So later we can see the result as it. Okay, so this is the output of the PayNet. We can see here you can check the detailed data as well as the analysis criteria you did. So here we get the data from the PayNet. So what if we do the comparison between different, how to see the data in different cities? We can get the result here as the comparison. Let's come to the comparison here. Yes, we just did the analysis on the comparison between the first-year cities and the non-first-year cities. Here, if we take the first-year cities as the benchmark, we can see the, generally speaking, there are 20 to 13% higher. The first-year cities higher than the non-first-year cities. So this is the base salary, and we can see the gap is the 20 to 13%. But the trend is that the gap between the both is smaller and smaller in the past several years and in the future. Okay, and also there's another factors we need to take into account when we look into the pay market in China. That is the ownership of the organizations. There are three major type of the ownership in China, the enterprise. The first one is we call the FOE, which means the foreign-owned enterprise. And also we have the POE, means the privately owned Chinese companies. And also the SOE stands for the state-owned companies, which have the government background. They are the same ownership type, but actually they are joining the same talent war with different tools. So they do have different features and different tools with competing talent in the market. The foreign-owned companies, they tend to pay the higher base to than local companies. There are many expatriates working in these organizations, and this style of salary package is more traditional, the Western traditional for those workers. The POE, the private-owned companies, those Chinese-owned companies usually pay a lower base but offer the extremely high incentive scheme to the employees. So when the POE perform the employees' earning will regularly outperform those FOEs. So here the incentive plans is not only the short-term incentive but also the long-term incentive for the employee who is working in the listed companies. Another advantage to being a private-owned company's employee is that the green zone around the desk. This is usually taken advantage of in the form of the allowance that is yet not subject to tax. But think about it, this is actually quite different for the foreign-owned companies do it in the same way. Finally, for the SOEs, the state-owned companies, like many other countries, the government workers in China command lower wage. There are, however, many perks, including the healthcare and even housing included in the package. And also, the employees working in the state-owned companies, they enjoy the stable life there. And also, just now, as you may see from the PayNet, we can also extract some data for by different ownerships. So let's also have a look at the analysis and the comparison between different ownerships of companies. Let's come to the result. Yeah. On this graph, what we can see here is that if we take the foreign-owned companies as a benchmark, we can see both POE and SOE, the base salary here is the base salary are much lower than FOEs. But remember, this is just the base salary. So, but if we take the benefits, allowance, and the incentives into account, the graph is not the case anymore. So that's why more and more top executives working in the foreign-owned companies are actually, being recruited by the FOE and SOEs. So we can see the competition nowadays is more and more sales. Okay, so this is the part for the market implications of China currently. So the following part, Wendy will bring more information on the China future trend for us. So I will pass the head to Wendy.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So Catherine's taken us through, when you're looking at the market data, how you need to take both geography and ownership into account, because from a geographical perspective, China pays very differently. And when you look at the ownership, as I think the words that Catherine used was, each different ownership type uses a different tool in that war for talent. So what I'm going to talk about to finish off this presentation is just in terms of looking ahead, what we see some of the challenges to be. If we go to the next slide. Looking forward, early 2013, there was a handover of power to a younger generation of leaders in China, and it's expected that there will be slow reform in the short term. So what this means is we're expecting the real growth to average out at around 7.9% over the next 5 years. This is slower but a more sustainable growth. There's going to be a very high focus on growing the Chinese middle class and ensuring that they become a nation of consumers rather than of producers over time, and that productivity is increased. So why is this important? Well, from the perspective of your global head offices in the US, many head offices in US and Europe are more in a cost-cutting mode, but they need to think very carefully about their strategy for China, because should the China operation be part of that global cost-cutting is a question. When we view most companies' business plans, they're still expecting China to show growth. However, if you look at the challenging landscape of China, the GDP there's a slower GDP growth now, and therefore it's getting harder for operations to show harder and harder to show the very high levels of growth expected. And at the same time, we can see that costs are not reducing at all. On the contrary, wages are increasing quite significantly, and this is really impacting labor-intensive companies. We know that as China becomes more economically developed, it's going to result in better paid employees at the mid and lower end as well. And then have a look at the local competition. This is where things are really getting stronger as well. So all these things are making China a more challenging landscape. And to make success and growth in China is probably getting a little harder than over the last 10 years, where literally being in China meant you typically were growing. However, it's not impossible. There's still certainly many, many opportunities. But what we're saying is companies are going to have to work harder to gain from those now. One of the things that I mentioned was that government initiative to drive more investment and development into the smaller cities. And these cities are going to be the fast-growing and expected to be China's future growth. If we have a look at the next slide, what I'm showing on this slide is that part of China's 5-year plan, there's plans to raise minimum wages and grow the middle class. What this slide can actually show you is between 2009 and 2013, what some of those minimum wages have increased by. Such growth is contributing to the higher salary movement in China. So now, going forward, there's pressure now from the bottom of the wage curve as well, and expected to be more so as the economy develops. As you can see from this, minimum wages actually vary across provinces and even within cities in China. To try and put this into context in US terms, if we have a look at Anhui, which is the first province I have there, it's one of the non-first-tier cities, the minimum wage has moved from 560 RMB a month, that's the equivalent of $90 to 1,010 RMB a month, the equivalent of $162 per month in terms of minimum wage. So although the increases are significantly big, as you can see, the actual dollar value when you compare it to the US is still way, way, way behind. But what all of this is meaning is that business risk in China is growing, but the return of business in China, in terms of the return on investment, is actually getting less. If we have a look at the next slide, what this graph is showing you, the line that runs across the zero on the axis, that is representing salaries in first-tier cities in China. Anything that falls below that line means that those are cheaper than first-tier cities in China, and anything that falls above that line means that that is more expensive. So what you can see is this rapid increase in growth in wages in China has meant that India and Vietnam are cheaper opportunities and more interesting opportunities for more labor-intensive companies to be moving into, even when you look at the non-first-tier cities in China. The non-first-tier cities in China, if you were to look at this graph over time, have really starting to catch up now over the last couple of years with those first-tier cities. If you have a look at the colors on the graph, red shows you the clerical roles, yellow shows you supervisory junior management, green shows you middle management, and blue shows you senior management. So what you can see when you compare China first-tier cities to the US is that at the clerical level, at the lower end, obviously the US is still paying nearly up to 3 times as much. But as you can see on the light blue chart, that at senior management, it's almost becoming the same. If we have a look at the next slide, the Hay Group China Pay Survey has shown that pay rises in China in 2012 were about 9.4%. You can see that that was very close to 2011 at 9.3%, and you can see the forecast of 2013 around 9.3%. So what we're showing is that salary increases actually stabilized, but at a high level exceeding 9%, and that's shown by the orange line on the graph. What I'm then trying to show on the graph is the purple line is actually indicating the inflation rate. So given that, as you can see, wages are so much higher, wage increases are much higher than inflation, what I'm implying here is that the take-home or the real pay rise that's actually going into the pockets of the Chinese employees is going to be around, or it was about 6.2% last year and around 4.2% in 2013. This actually makes China one of the highest wage inflation countries in the world. So if we discount for inflation, they are now one of the more expensive in terms of actually increases. To put this into context, for example, in Argentina, your wage increases might be 25%, but so is your inflation. So your actual take-home pay at the end of the day is not that much different. This means that it's becoming more and more expensive to do business in China, with the wages being so much higher than inflation. And speaking of salary movement and wage inflation, what I'm going to show you on the next slide. This slide will show you the salary movement we recorded over these sectors in 2011, in 2012, and late last year we asked our participants what they were forecasting for 2013. And as I say, you can see those fairly consistent figures, often around in the early 9-point-something%. What we did early this year, at the end of the first quarter, was we polled a number of our participants to find out, for those who did do increases, what was the actual movement. And what you can see is that it was actually it was more prudent than what you saw the forecast to be. But you need to take this into account. If you put this into context, in the first quarter of this year, the economy was slower and felt slower than it had been. There was a new leadership in government, and a number of changes like that, which perhaps were making people a little bit more hesitant. But we're still expecting that by the end of 2013, those pay increases are probably still going to be close to 9% again. So that's actually going to bring us to the end of our presentation. I just moved to a slide to try and conclude some of the points that we've brought to you here. China has been and continues to be a challenging place to implement reward, and you can see that through the factors of the steep pay curves and the high turnover and things that we've presented through today. But it's leadership and management concerns that need to be the top priority to help stem some of the turnover issues and therefore some of the pay pressure that we feel is really important. And when you are using market data, to really take care that you're measuring like with like, because reward can vary significantly by geography and ownership and other things as well. So this is the end of our presentation today, and hopefully this has provided you with some useful information about China. And now what I want to do is hand back so that we can have the questions facilitated.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Catherine. That was a really great presentation there. We do have a lot of questions that came in through the chat, so thank you, everyone, for submitting those. And I also want to thank everyone for their patience while they waited to dial in. We did experience a full capacity phone line earlier today, but our Hay Group colleagues graciously signed off so that our clients could sign on, so thank you to them. And also thank you for your patience throughout the presentation with any glitches that happened. But before I actually get to your questions, there is a question that I have for you. We covered various focus points in today's webinar, so I'm asking you to select any categories that you would like more information on. We have pay, which is anything like reward communication, rewards, or benefits, including PayNet. Also, we have talent, like retention, talent management, performance management, or training and development. And then lastly, we have effectiveness, which is also known as employee engagement, so anything with engagement, enablement, or barriers to performance. So just take a minute there and let us know if you'd like any more information on any of those, and then we can get to your questions. All right, so while you're filling that out, I just want to remind everyone that today's webinar was recorded and will be posted to our website. All attendees will receive the presentation slides from today's webinar. And I also want to point out that after you sign off from our webinar, if you could please just take 2 minutes to complete the post-webinar survey so that we can collect your feedback and improve future webinars, it would be greatly appreciated. All right, so at this point, I will go ahead and start reviewing the questions that came in through the chat. All right, so Wendy and Catherine, whoever is best placed to answer these questions, just feel free to jump in. Let's see, on the price of promotions tab, what are the typical grade differentials in percentage terms for these different levels?
Right, I'm happy to answer that, and I'm hoping I'm understanding the question right, and if I'm not, whoever's asked the question's got my email address at the end there, so they're welcome to get in touch with me. In terms of so what we've done is we've used the Hay Group reference levels as an example of grades here, and that means in terms of the Hay, there's a 15% increase in Hay points between each of our grades, if that's providing some of the grade differentiation. In terms within China, when you move from the midpoint of one grade to the midpoint of another grade, in those second two categories that we're looking at, grades are typically moving at around 40%. So the midpoint of one grade to the midpoint of the next grade is around a 40% increase in pay thereabouts. And if then you're looking in terms of bringing people into a grade within China and then moving them through the grade, what we find is that those grades, the minimum and maximum of the grades within China are much broader than what we see typically in a more developed economy. In a more developed economy, we typically see a structure where people use a sort of 80, 120 rule, so they bring new people in at as low as sort of 80% of their pay range, and they may go as high as 120. If you were to implement that in China, your grades actually wouldn't even overlap because the pay curve is too steep for that. So we tend to see something much more like going up to 130 or 140% at the top of those grades. So I'm hoping that I've answered your question, but as I say, my email address is at the end there if I haven't quite answered it and you need me to expand on that further.
Thanks, Wendy. And hopefully that did answer Eric's question there. Another question, I think it refers to this slide here, salary movements. A question was asked, or maybe it wasn't this one. The question was, are the statistics presented based on 2012 information? I have a feeling it's more likely this slide. Do you want to speak to that real quick?
I'm sorry, is it 2012 information, did you say? Was that the question?
That was the question, yes. Yes.
On this side, what I did was I just went to the IMF and US Bureau of Statistics and was using the latest information I could find on their website. I can't remember the exact date on it, to be honest, but it was the latest information that they were making available.
Okay, thank you. And Tiffany asks, do we see multinationals sending expats on assignments to China? And is there any prevalence for hiring third country nationals or independent contractors from other countries such as Australia or Singapore?
So we do still see many expats coming into China, but this is being managed and is being looked at by many organizations. They're either trying to manage the packages and the pay, but they are definitely looking at alternatives. And there's a couple of really interesting alternatives, some of which you've mentioned there. They are looking at third country nationals. So within Asia, we're seeing a much higher expatriate population moving in from other Asian countries. We actually now have a new group of people called locally hired foreigners. So many foreigners that have come over as an expat and are localizing themselves and wishing to stay and not return back on their assignments. They become what they refer to as a locally hired foreigner. And typically the locally hired foreigner, they take the local package and then add some items on top of that, typically because those locally hired foreigners often can't access a number of the benefits and schools and things like that, and also because of the experience that they are already bringing. And then I think one of the most interesting categories at the moment is what they refer to as the returnees. These are really becoming hot property at the moment. These are Chinese people who have gone overseas, typically usually to study and then to do work, and they're returning back to China because China's a stable economy. They're coming back to their families, and these are folks that are really becoming very sought after in the market. Are these Chinese returnees who are obviously speaking very well in terms of language. They've got international experience and exposure, and now they're able to integrate back home into China as well. So hopefully that answers that question.
All right, thank you. And Tiffany, thank you for that question as well. Paul asks, he wants to know whether we have any information on the treatment of local hires, which we were just talking about, with local experience versus employees who have international experience or are returning Chinese nationals who have worked outside China.
Yep. So the returning Chinese nationals are definitely earning a higher increase. We ran an expatriate survey and a locally hired survey, I think it was around 18 months ago, and if you send me an email again, I'll happy to give you sort of a percentage increase in terms of how much more that they are earning. I can't remember the number off the top of my head. And those with multinational experience, if you require, in the roles, if you're requiring people to be more fluent within English and to be communicating in English and to be working in an environment where perhaps they are interacting more overseas, then you definitely are paying a premium for people who will have that multinational experience.
All right, great. And Kimberly asks if you could discuss some of the allowances that employees are using to augment base pay.
Catherine, do you want to pick that one up? Or? No? Okay. So the most typical, one of the allowances that Chinese employees are able to access will be a housing allowance. housing within China is, I guess, one of the biggest issues and one of the biggest concerns, particularly of the younger generation. And so housing allowance is one that we do see a lot of organizations providing to their employees, because quite often it's a way, it also has a tax benefit. It's a way that they are able to actually receive money and not have to pay the income tax on it as well. So that has that double feature in terms of that being the most commonly used allowance.
All right, great. And Steve asks the question here. I'm going to keep it pretty broad. He does get into detail, but and Steve, we can take this offline. But just for the rest of the audience, can you tell us about how far out the first-tier cities do those pay premiums apply?
Okay. It's a good question, because what's happening within China is they're installing a very fast train network, and so the first-tier city is expanding and expanding in terms of, if you look at the geography of Shanghai, for example, and so that first-tier city premium starts to expand further and further out as it gets easier through transport to be able to move in and in. So there are some cities such as Suzhou, Hangzhou, sitting just outside of Shanghai, for example, which, although they may not be paying the same at the first tier, if you specifically select those cities around Shanghai, you will see that they are definitely paying more than the other non-first tier cities. So within all the cities outside of the first tier, there's quite some differentiation depending on how close they are to the economic hubs.
Yes, exactly. As Wendy mentioned, actually, if you talk about the non-first tier cities like the Suzhou and the Ningbo, the Hangzhou, they pay premiums is still a lot, and its pay is quite close to the first tier cities like Shanghai. That's why we say there are some cities located in the eastern coast is quite, still quite high pay compared with the inland province. So one of the reasons is that because they are quite close to Shanghai, so the talents are normally originally from Shanghai. They transfer to those cities nearby, so which triggers up the city pay levels there.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And so, Steve, hopefully that answers your question mostly, but a Hay Group colleague will be reaching out to you to answer the rest of your questions that are a little bit more specific to your company. Michelle here asks, are pay structures typically different between first-tier cities, like Shanghai versus Shenzhen?
Well, actually, so far as I know, most of our clients actually are using the same pay structure or same city pay index applied to the same cities. So in another word, if you do have the plant or the branch in Shanghai or Shenzhen, normally they will be using the same pay structures. Well, of course, in Shenzhen, some industries, the pay will be a little bit lower than compared with in Shanghai, but at least the policy or the guidelines will be quite the same.
Thank you. And Catherine, maybe you can answer this question too, and forgive me if I mispronounce the city name, but Lanny asks, what about Guizhou?
Guizhou, yes. Guizhou, I think is yes, the city. It's not Guangzhou. Guangzhou is one of the first cities, but Guizhou is actually city in the southwest of the China. So it's an inland province. Normally, it's some companies will call it third tier city or fourth tier city. So the pay is I think it will be 30 to 40% lower than compared with Shanghai. So it's there is a gap between Guizhou and the first tier cities, definitely.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Kimberly asks, how are companies creating an internal promotion environment similar to the external environment. Can either of you speak to that?
So what companies are trying to do is, because the pay increases, even in general, even without a promotion, tend to be reasonably high. So if you've brought somebody in, sort of a little bit low in the pay grade, and that pay grade is moving at around 9-10% a year, and you're trying to move them through the pay grade during that time, the actual pay increases that are being offered are quite high. So what many organizations are doing is they're finding a way to put some mid-steps into their normal grading structure. So, for example, if they have a grade A, they're doing A1, A2, A3, and when they give those pay increases, they're actually treating it closer to a promotion. They're communicating it as a promotion. They perhaps linking it to a career path, and actually allowing people to feel like they're getting regular promotions maybe once every 12 to 18 months, and to actually make them feel like they're out in the external environment where people are job hopping every 18 months or so as well. So they're keeping their global framework and their global salary structure in place, but they're putting sort of some intermediate grades within their banding structure to actually allow the feel of regular promotions. And obviously, it raises other questions in terms of, internal equity with other countries and things, but this is the way that they're finding that they're needing to manage that expectation of promotion within China. Another thing that they're doing is that they may have their own job titling system. To be honest, the job title system in China can actually be a little bit more inflated. So you get to use the word senior and manager and vice president very quickly. And so although they may have a global titling system internally within a country, within China, they're allowing people to use a slightly more inflated job titling system which matches what's happening in the market, so that people don't only feel they're getting their promotion, they also feel that the job titles are equivalent to what they're getting in the market as well. So those are just two ways, as an example, of what they're trying to do internally to create that same environment and same feel. Because what's happening is many of the university graduates are looking across at their peers. So many of these university graduates have come through an education system which has been extremely driven on being the best and at the top, because that means you can get into the better high schools, which means you get into the better universities, which means you get the better jobs. And so they've gone through that sort of an education system. So when they get into work, they're continually comparing themselves to their peers as they go through those first few years again. I'm not sure if hopefully that helps to answer the question.
I think that should have answered it pretty well. I think that was a great answer. So I am conscious of time. We're over our limit already. We do have some outstanding questions still, but we're just going to go ahead and reach out to each one of you offline. Either your account manager or a Hay Group colleague will be reaching out. Also, if you requested any additional information on pay talent or effectiveness, a Hay Group representative will also be in touch. If you do need to reach out directly, please feel free to reach out to Wendy or Catherine. Their contact information is right there on the screen. But thank you again for joining us today. We hope you found this informative and insightful, and have a great rest of the day.